I don't just talk about other people's stuff, I also make my own. Books in particular. To date, I have 4 books you can check out on Amazon. Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and the short story collection Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Hop on down to the description for Amazon links to all 4 books. Enjoy whichever ones you read, and enjoy the video. I'd like to begin this video by presenting you with a bit of a hypothetical scenario. Let us suppose, just for the sake of the scenario I'm setting up, that the skull and crossbones symbol was completely stricken from global society. For whatever reason, the symbol fell out of favor, it was deemed to be offensive for one reason or another, and so it was completely scrubbed. Movies that had it were edited. Novelty pirate flags stopped being sold. It was completely gone. Nowhere was it ever left. And so, several generations went by without ever having seen or heard of this symbol. Now, after these few generations pass, let us suppose we have a child exploring the woods, and he happens upon a house that's been around for a while but is abandoned. For as long as anyone can remember, no one has been there. But there's still stuff inside, so he decides to go in and do some exploring, because who's going to stop him? And as he's wandering through the kitchen area, he looks through the cupboards, and he finds a little bottle. There's still some liquid in it, but the label is mostly faded. He can't tell what the words are, so he doesn't know what it says. The only thing he can still see is this odd picture on it that looks like a human skull and a pair of bones making an X on it. He has no idea what that symbol means, but he's been wandering around for a while, he's feeling kind of thirsty, the bottle has liquid in it, and, well, if it's in the kitchen, stands to reason it must be a drink of some sort. Now, what reason does he have not to drink the contents of that bottle? Because after all, he's never seen a skull and crossbones before. He doesn't know that when a skull and crossbones is on a bottle, that means the contents are poisonous. Keep that in mind as we move forward with this particular video. And before we get into the meat of it, I have to make a little correction. When I did the video about mouse getting banned in Tennessee from the school curriculums, when I initially read that article, it sure as heck looked to me like they said it was being banned in the entire state. And that's what I said in the video. The more I see other people talking about it, and going back to read that initial video, read the initial article, you don't read videos unless they're subtitled. But anyway, going back to read the article, hearing other people reporting on it, it seems I overstated that. It turns out that it was just banned in a single district from the 8th grade curriculum. So that part, I confess, I didn't get right. However, that doesn't mean I'm retracting anything I said in that video. Other than that, what I said otherwise about it, how banning it is a big mistake, and how it could potentially lead to worse things down the line, because this is yet another example of something being deemed worthy of censorship for the dumbest of reasons, that stuff I do not rescind. And I stand by everything else in that video. I just wanted to make the correction. Now that the correction is out of the way, let us get on with the main point of this video, and you will see how it ties into what I said at the beginning. Recently, I have taken it upon myself to join the chorus of people speaking out against cancel culture and censorship because I was sick of just sitting back and doing nothing. I was waiting for saner heads to prevail and bring about the positive change that would get away from all that nonsense, but it wasn't happening, at least not happening fast enough, and I've decided that I'd rather be proactive than inactive. However, in amongst all of this discussion, I've realized that there's something which hasn't really been spoken about that much as far as I've seen. You'll see plenty of people talking about all the different examples of when cancel culture cancels something that really didn't need canceling in the first place, either because it wasn't really that offensive, it was only perceived as offensive, or you know the drill. You've been witnessing it as well as I have. But here's where I want to bring the conversation towards a more constructive direction. You see, there's something we have to acknowledge. There is such a thing as offensive content. It does exist. We can't pretend that it doesn't. There is stuff that was made as part of our entertainment and part of our popular culture. Pretty much every culture has this, of course. But there is stuff that used to be considered acceptable, even though it was designed to be a mockery of people based on the fact that they were from different cultures, or the fact that they looked different, or things like that. And that stuff just has not aged very well. And the fact is that even in its time, it really wasn't okay, because the intention behind it was to be hurtful. We have to acknowledge that that was the case. Now, a lot of the stuff that winds up being the subject of cancel culture doesn't fall under that category, but the stuff that does, well, it is worth addressing. But that doesn't necessarily mean I think censorship is the answer for those things either. And I'm going to elaborate on that. Let us, just for the sake of argument, zero in on blackface. Now, blackface is pretty easy to agree upon in terms of how offensive it is. It was designed to be a mockery. It was white people donning makeup to make themselves look like black people and then adopting exaggerated traits, not many of them very flattering traits, in order to portray black people as somehow lesser than white people. That is the way blackface was done. Even in its milder forms, though, where it was just taking a white person and slapping them with grease paint to make them look black, you're still looking at how that was assigning a white person to a role that otherwise should have gone to a person who actually fit that race. And it's not just blackface, of course. It's not just white people who do it to black people. There's also such a thing as brown face, yellow face. It extends to all sorts of different cultures. And really, technically anyone can do it. Anyone can do their faces up to look like a different race. And they have the potential to, once they have done that, portray whatever race they are done up as in a negative light. But anyway, staying focused, blackface, we can pretty much all agree, is not okay. Even if it was once accepted by the popular culture, it's not accepted now. And with good reason, of course. Let us go back to the year 2009, however, when we had the release of Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen, the second of the live-action Transformers movies. And we had these two show up. The Autobot twins, Skids and Mudflap. From the moment they were revealed, there was controversy around these two, because people who saw and heard them in the few clips that were released prior to the movie's actual release date seemed to depict them as blackface minstrel show caricatures. Among the traits people pointed to support this claim was things like their facial features. They have comically large ears, buck teeth, beady eyes, very flat areas where their noses would be. They spoke in high-pitched voices with very poor English dialect. In fact, their dialect is one that you would normally associate with black people in the inner city. I'm just saying that's what it sounded like, and that's probably what the intention was. And of course, you also had traits like how it was clearly stated neither of them knew how to read, another stereotype applied to people who believe black people are illiterate. Or how they are purely comic relief, who do not contribute anything of value to anything in the movie, really. They don't really move the plot forward, they don't make any useful contributions to the final battle, they're just there for us to laugh at them. And to complete the idea of the blackface minstrel show idea, only one of them was actually voiced by a black voice actor. The other was voiced by a white voice actor, meaning that it was a white guy adopting quote-unquote black traits. Now, in the days prior to the movie's release, this was not just accepted as, oh look, blackface caricatures. This was instead the source of debate. And I remember seeing these debates. It was very long ago, long before I started the channel. I didn't get any screen grabs of any of these things, but maybe you saw them too, who knows? And among the counter-arguments to those claims were things like, well, they can't be blackface caricatures because they're not human. They're robots that turn into cars. Another classic counter-argument was, they can't be blackface caricatures because there are real people out there like that. I know, I've met people who are just like that, so how can they be caricatures if you have real examples of it? Now, of course, these counter-arguments can themselves be counter-argued. For starters, the idea that just because they're not human, that means they cannot be caricaturing humans, that doesn't really fly. Now, we have seen examples recently of people attempting to read racism into non-human characters where that was never the intention. For example, in the fantasy genre, where you have people claiming that all orcs are based on black people, I mean, that's a good example of reading it into the source, because most people look at orcs and see orcs. Orcs are designed to be their own culture, and for you to see not just black characteristics, but negative black characteristics within them, that I think ultimately says more about the observer than it does about the observed. But that does not mean it cannot happen. It is possible for people to come up with creatures that are not human, but which are designed to caricature certain races. For example, in L. Ron Hubbard's Battlefield Earth, there is an alien that shows up who is clearly designed to be an Asian stereotype, because he speaks in sort of a broken language. He is very subservient in his stance with his arms like this, and he's always bowing, sort of like a typical Mandarin Chinese kind of figure that you would see in Western culture. And I think even the name of the species, I don't remember it exactly, but it's sort of playing, I think the name was sort of designed to sound sort of like, oh, all Chinamen say ching chang chong kind of thing. So, not that I'm saying that, mind you, I'm giving you an example. Don't dare take me out of context on this. But that's an example of what I'm talking about. So if it can happen there, it can obviously happen with Skids and Mudflap. Now, as for the idea that they can't be stereotypes because there are real people out there who have those characteristics, well, there is some truth to the idea that every stereotype comes from somewhere, and it only really becomes a stereotype when you start applying it across the board. That being said, though, even if you could find a real human being who embodied all of those minstrel show characteristics in real life, do you really think the production team on Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen had that individual in mind when they were making these characters? And that's assuming you can actually find such a person. You know, having had the misfortune of seeing Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen myself, I'll just cut right to the chase and tell you, yeah, they were right to cry racism this time. They really did embody all of those negative traits, and even if they're not human, they still embody the stereotypes we see in the minstrel show. But my question has never been about why people were debating it. My question has always been, how did they even make it into the movie? You're telling me that from the whole process, from pre-production all the way to the film's release, nobody ever looked at these two and said, guys, does anyone else think these look wrong? 'Cause I think they look kinda wrong. And got people actually thinking about whether or not they were embracing things they shouldn't be? I don't know, I just don't buy that. It seems weird. Unless, of course, there is a scenario in which that could have happened. Now, like I said, blackface had fallen out of favor a while ago. I mean, depending on what you think of this current trend in Hollywood of casting black actors in roles that are traditionally white, but that's a whole other topic for a whole other day. The thing is, blackface, in a minstrel show sense at least, had been completely removed from pop culture. There were no new works that were producing it, and as for the older works that produced it, they weren't necessarily censored or banned, but no one was in a hurry to show them either. In fact, when we got to the 80s and 90s and the advent of the home video market on that brand new wonderful invention, the videotape, well, when it came to videotape releases, there were four priorities, four categories that were favored for release. You had the new releases, the stuff that was just in theaters, had its run, or had just aired on TV, brand spanking new, and was now being made available in this format. You had the really, really popular classics. That's the stuff that just transcended the time frames they were made in and became just parts of the popular culture, from Citizen Kane to Dracula, anything like that. You had direct-to-video material, stuff that was made specifically for this new medium, and you had children's stuff because mom and dad needed a break, and then again the children's stuff could fall into any of those other three categories. That meant that there was a lot of material that just wasn't being released, or at least wasn't being widely distributed. You walk into a store and you weren't likely to see many obscure movies in their video section. You walk into something like a Blockbuster or another video rental place, you might have better luck, but there was still a lot of stuff that just wasn't available. Not until the advent of the DVD, when suddenly every movie ever made was being released in this new format. How that happened, I don't know, but a lot of film buffs are glad that it did happen. However, as more and more stuff was getting released, people started to realize that some of the stuff that was being planned for release had stuff that was offensive in it. Stuff like blackface. So every now and then on VHS you had something like that happen where there was an old Looney Tunes cartoon or an old Disney cartoon where a character had something blow up in their faces and suddenly their faces were dark except for a light area around their mouths. But those tended to be trimmed and hardly anyone noticed. When it came for the DVDs, though, the decision was made that all the material should be kept in. And if something in these uncut, unaltered versions of the films or cartoons or shows or whatever had not aged very well, there was context provided. Either an audio commentary or a note on the packaging or something that said, this stuff contains material that might be seen as offensive. We don't endorse what the content actually consists of, but we also don't believe in censorship, so we're going to release it anyway, and we trust that you will understand the context in which it was made. Which was a perfectly sound way of doing things. However, because it took so long, well, most people agree that a generation is about 25 years. So there were several generations that went by without seeing this material, and by extension, not really having a good idea of what a blackface caricature looks like. They may have heard about it, they may have seen some clips taken out of context, or maybe read a teeny little blurb about it in a sociology textbook at some point in their school careers, but they never really actually saw what this thing was, nor did they ever get a sense of why it was so offensive. And the people who would have been working on Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen would have been among one of those generations that grew up in that time. Now, I admit I can't prove this, but I have to wonder if the reason Skids and Mudflap and other similar characters turned out that way is because the people making them didn't have that frame of reference. They didn't really have a proper understanding of what a blackface minstrel show caricature looked like. They just thought they were making funny comic relief characters that would be popular with children, because a lot of these things, like Transformers, were originally made with children in mind. And so they took a bunch of traits that they thought were funny and slapped them all together, not realizing what they were accidentally reviving. I mean, it's also possible that there was a secret cabal of Klansmen who were manipulating things behind the scenes to get these evil stereotypes out there, but I just feel like the scenario of them not realizing what they were doing makes more sense. And I can't really say that I blame them that much, because how would they know the bottle has poison in it if they'd never seen a skull and crossbones before? Hence why I opened with that little hypothetical for you. Whenever cancel culture reared its ugly head and canceled something that was completely innocuous, something like a children's book or a cartoon, or things that really didn't need censoring, I and many other people would always hop on Amazon or eBay or some similar site to check and see and always confirm that books like Mein Kampf and movies like Birth of a Nation were still available, brand spanking new, in print, affordable price for anyone to buy. Now, of course, part of the reason that we would always look this up and point it out was to draw attention to the sheer absurdity of it. Literal Nazi propaganda was still available to the masses, yet a children's book was deemed too dangerous to see the light of day. It didn't make sense. But there's another reason we keep bringing it up, although it's a reason that I admit hasn't really been touched on all that often. You see, if you were to ask somebody to justify why Mein Kampf and Birth of a Nation and similar works are still kept in print and readily available, if you ask them to explain why that's okay, the answer would probably be along the lines of saying it's for educational purposes. Yes, these works contain very hateful, very awful ideologies. However, the importance of keeping them around and keeping them available for people to experience is not to perpetuate those ideologies, but so people will understand the context, so that people will know where we were, and these works must be presented in such a way as they can understand why they were horrible, why they had an influence, yes, but also why that influence was bad. Now, by keeping these works in print, is there a risk that somebody can come along, get these works, buy into the ideologies presented, and keep them going, keep those ideologies alive? Yes, there is a risk of that. But it's a risk that must be taken because we have to keep in mind the context. Most people will understand the context. The wise man once said that those who do not learn from history are destined to repeat it. But how can we learn from history if there's nothing to actually access? If we can't access the history, we can't learn from it. Therefore, that is the reason most people will give you as to why Mein Kampf, Birth of a Nation, and other such works are still in print. And you know what? That is a sound argument. At least I think it's a sound argument. Acknowledging that there is a danger that by keeping these things around, the ideology remains alive, but also acknowledging that when presented in the right context, people will understand why these works were bad and know that, basically have a frame of reference of what to look for should something like these ideologies arise again in the future. Now, if this argument can be applied to, again, literal racist propaganda, works that were designed specifically to spread hatred and racism, why can't that same idea be applied to something like And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street? Why can't we take these older works that contain this outdated material and say, yes, the stuff you'll see in here is wrong, but you gotta understand why it was wrong, and we're providing the context for it. I think that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. Something like it was already being done. Again, when DVDs were taking off, that's what the studios were doing when it came time to release the movie that they forgot had a blackface number in it. And it worked. People accepted it. We need to bring that idea back. I am fairly convinced, even though I can't prove it, that my scenario for why blackface caricatures wound up in movies like Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen is a very likely one. And that's why I think we need to have access to these things. I don't believe in being hateful towards anyone, but I do believe that we need to learn from history, and we cannot learn from history if that history is extinguished. I think that is a perfectly sound solution. We need to have access to these things, not because we want to perpetuate hatred, but because we need to recognize what hatred looks like. We won't know what a bottle of poison is if we've never seen a skull and crossbones before. And we won't know what blackface is if we've never seen a movie where blackface has turned up. It's gotta be presented with the right context. That is key. You can't just put it out there and trust that people will just understand what's wrong with it. But at the same time, you still have to put it out there. Censorship won't solve anything. It hasn't solved anything so far. If anything, it's just made stuff worse. So instead of sweeping things under the rug, pretending it never existed, and then waiting a few generations for people to make those same mistakes that you were trying to prevent anyway, use this older material to educate. Use it to help people understand, and then we can finally move on from all of this garbage. I mean, I don't know if it's the solution, but I certainly think it's a solution. I think it's part of the solution, at least. But I can only do so much to get it out there. The rest is up to you guys, whether or not you decide it's worth trying. And that I have no control over. Maybe I don't want to end it that dourly, so search your hearts. Deep down, you know what's right. Congratulations, you reached the end. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to consider supporting us on Patreon. Of course, the other way to support us is to go to Amazon and check out our books: Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, The Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Also check the description for links to DeviantArt and other platforms we operate. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.